Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk a little bit about my research. It is my favorite topic. I am an absolute nerd for what I do. I hope I can share some of that enthusiasm and energy with you this morning. I hope everyone's had a quick cup of tea and coffee as we get into some of the entanglements and relationships between religion and AI in some ways that might be a little surprising. So, this talk involves both existing work that's out there in the world, but also some very new things I've been working on. So, developing just checking out actually what's happening at sort of the coalface of that interaction. But I wanted to start just briefly by talking in more detail about what I do. So thank you for the wonderful introduction, but to be very specific, my approach is anthropological. So I'm observing and paying attention to these entanglements of religion and AI where they're happening, whether it's on social media or it might be happening in the imaginary spaces of science fiction, of pop culture references, the aesthetics and ideas of how we should imagine AI come up along in that discussion as well. I look at the narratives and the tropes, the repeating stories that really shape our conception of what AI is and where it's going to go, but also is entangled with a conception of what religion is as well. I look at both implicit and explicit forms of religiosity and new religious movements, so things that are emerging out of these imaginaries of AI, but also how established religions are using and paying attention to artificial intelligence. And I think about the question of existential risk, which I divide into people's existential hopes and their existential despairs. There are positive and negative interpretations, utopianisms and dystopianisms when people speculate on the future of AI. Now that's the textual list, but I also like to show this slide as a representation of the spaces as an anthropologist I like to be in. So the mix there of literature, science fiction, meme culture, online social media, tweets, not on X as much as I used to be for various reasons, but I'm still on Blue Sky if you're interested in finding me there. But social media spaces where conversations are happening, actual exhibitions of robots, more kind of corporate catalytic spaces as well. But all of this together is a part of the conversation people are having about AI. And being in those spaces, I often come across the idea that religion and AI are very distinctly separate. That religion is something of the past, it's about doctrine and tradition and looking backwards. And unfortunately, there's something embedded in my slides that makes that one slide move on when I don't want it to. And I tried to fix it last night. It's still doing it. But this idea that AI is the opposite, is something of the future, it's progress, it's technology and advancement, and this sort of pulls on the stereotypes we're very familiar with from the conversation about religion and science as well. And as I say, my main argument is always that these are very much entangled with each other. You cannot consider AI without considering its cultural context, and that involves religion. And you can't now consider religion. It's still going forward when I don't want it to. You can't consider religion without its engagement with technology, including artificial intelligence. So in the book that I published last year, Religion and AI: An Introduction, I drew out this very broad typology with a caveat very strongly that these are not mutually exclusive relationships. So we see in different religions and different to the granular level to different religious believers aspects of rejection, adoption, and adaptation when it comes to the religious response to AI. One individual can reject one specific use of AI while adopting the general concept, while also adapting to a society and a culture that is increasingly controlled by ubiquitous AI. Now, it's commonly easiest to spot examples of adoption because they're the showiest, they're the flashiest. So I'll come back to these two examples in a moment, but briefly, the first picture there is from a church in Nuremberg in Germany, where in 2023 they had a chat GPT generated sermon with an avatar up on the screen as well. And it's a little hard to make out, but there are people there sort of with their cameras recording, and it was a bit of a showy performance moment. And the other example there is a Pepper robot priest in Japan. So I'll talk about those in a moment. But it's commonly easier to see examples of adoption. They get more attention, but the rejection narrative is sometimes the one the press is actually more interested in. So commonly in interviews, I get asked, which religion is most likely to reject AI? And I refute the premise of the question. There is not one single religious answer from one monolithic concept of religion. Everyone's responses are going to be different, but they don't like that nuance. But this is the actuality of what's happening. So, in cases of rejection, I also like to draw out the nuance that rejection is not just a monolithic thing in itself as well. There's a scale of rejection, everything from sort of passive disassociation or criticism or denial up to the more sort of strong abjection, disgust, ostracism. You see the hard line of rejection. So, for instance, as a case of minor religious rejection, in the Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI that I co-edited with Fraser Watts that came out last year, we had a chapter from Hannah Gould and Keiko Nishimura who note that objections to the Pepper priest largely concern practicality, notably the religious agency of Pepper and the efficacy of the sutras it offered to the dead do not feature promptly in Japanese language and news coverage. Instead, they note that the price of renting such robots is very high, it's 50,000 yen per night, and they're very difficult to operate, cumbersome, and prone to overheating, which I would say are all elements not ordinarily found to be problematic with human priests. Yeah, there's maybe mostly. Yeah, so rejection doesn't have to mean this very strong, visceral reaction. It can just be this thing doesn't make sense in terms of its practicalities. But of course, we do find the stronger forms of rejection. In the theological sphere of various different religious, established religions, sometimes this rejection is framed around questions of personhood and the relationship of an AI or a robot, or sometimes those two things are sort of merged together in conception, isn't about the question of its relationship to a creator. So in Islam, as a brief example, Sophia the Hanson robot, which is there in the top right of the bald-headed robotic form, she was granted honorary citizenship about 10 years ago in Saudi Arabia, which led to all this online discussion about whether this was haram under Islamic rules, that you cannot represent a humanoid in Islamic art. Was creating a robot an example of this as well? And similarly, other faiths try to place and locate AI and robots within their existing doctrines and ideas. So in Judaism, an article for 2017 asked the question whether the golem, as a sort of signifier of artificial life from Jewish mythology, could be equivalent to the robot, and in which case could earlier texts about the golem and its place in the minyan, could that also be applicable to AI and robots? Now, in the Cambridge Companion to Religion and AI that I edited, as I mentioned, we have a wonderful chapter from David Kalman, sort of looking at how AI is and isn't like the concept of the golem. So that's sort of a development of that discussion more recently in 2024. And then in Christianity, commonly the conversation goes to concepts of imago Dei. So we see theologians like Anne First trying to argue that actually that the creation of AI might be seen as a co-creation with God, rather than working against God's intentions. This is actually what was always proceeding from the original creation. And we see also a lot of Christian theologians thinking with Buber, using the I, thou, I, it distinction. I have a brief list here. You can look up their names later, but there's at least 5 people there who use the same sort of argument from a Christian theological perspective to think about where we locate AI in relation to creation ideas. Now, of course, as I mentioned, you get on that spectrum of rejection some of the much stronger versions. We can see this actually in some of the existential risk conversations, the AI apocalypticism that says when AI becomes significantly advanced enough, it will self-improve itself to the point that it's out of our control, sometimes commonly understood as the technological singularity. Some people use the term superintelligence. Some people think artificial general intelligence will actually have this status as well. But let's just broadly say fearful conceptions of powerful AI. Now, AI apocalypticism doesn't often have a message of renewal built into it that the established religious forms of apocalypticism do, but they draw on religious narratives and tropes. So, for example, back in 2014, Elon Musk at the MIT Aeronautics and Astronautics Department Centennial Symposium argued that the existential risks posed by superintelligent AI meant that our current trajectory of AI development risked summoning the demon. Now, of course, that is metaphorical language, but the influence of that sort of idea plays out in other spaces. So there's a book here, Summoning the Demon, which is about artificial intelligence in the image of the beast. For some people, they take a much more literal, supernatural interpretation of where AI is coming from, also entangled with ideas like transhumanism, which is the use of technology to deal with the pernicious problems of humanity like death. So some people's interpretations of transhumanism and its connection to AI is that this is something demonic, satanic, taking people away again from being in the image of God and having a soul. We see also in the narratives, even in very secular spaces or overtly secular spaces like the New Yorker, concerns about godlike AI coming to crush us all. So the image top right there, this idea that AI will come and take over, destroy humanity in particular ways, plays into tropes about godlikeness as well. The second category, adoption. We've had sociologists, anthropologists, economics experts think about what it takes for technologies to be adopted and become ubiquitous. And many of these models are very much based on a view of humans as rational agents who will make rational decisions when faced with options that either benefit or harm them. And they tend to fall into the line of saying there is an S curve of adoption, though, illustrated here, that adoption begins slowly, accelerates, and then slows again as the market becomes saturated. And we can identify specific factors in the speed of this adoption, such as knowledge about the technology, familiarity, uncertainty, and so forth. But very few of these accounts of the adoption of technology think about the cultural or religious aspect in particular. And in fact, we might see something in the nature of particular religious attitudes that lend themselves more to adoption over others. But as I said, adoption tends to be the most visible of the three categories, that it is easier to point out where someone is using AI versus where they have internally decided to reject it for various reasons if they're not verbal about it or textual about it. So as I mentioned, the Nuremberg church example had a variety of responses, again, going back to this non-exclusivity of these terms, these types. Just because there is an example of adoption, it doesn't mean everyone in that situation adopts it to the same degree. So some people were more positive and some were less positive in the audience. So the interview here says that the young pastor says there was something missing in the experience, any kind of emotional spirituality, which he says is essential when he writes his own sermons. So people sort of attended, it was very well attended, about 300 people turned up, but the actual nature of the response wasn't universally positive either. And then the final category that I use is adaptation. It's a very subtle relationship that's even harder to note than the others. So once a technology becomes ubiquitous and part of the background of the cultural system in which organizations and institutions operate, it can become hard to divine the changes and influences, the adaptations that it's bringing about. So drawing on the work of Bourdieu, we talk about habitus, how we respond to the world. And he says, when habitus encounters a social world of which it is the product, it is like a fish in water. It does not feel the weight of the water, and it takes the world about itself for granted. So increasingly, as AI becomes a part of our systems in invisible ways, we shift and change and adapt to it in particular ways we may not even consciously think about. I mean, as an anthropologist, that is the main task that I'm involved in, making the everyday, the commonplace, uncommon, to draw attention to it. But just as an example, how many people here go through automatic facial recognition at passport control when they come in? Yes. How many of you wear glasses? Yeah. How many of you have to take your glasses off when you go through? Yes. We shift our personalities, our appearance, our needs to deal with the facial recognition software that cannot recognize us with glasses on. So that's just a very small example, but we are shifting and changing our attitudes because of algorithmic systems behind the scenes and what they present. But we're also shifting and changing and adapting our attitudes based on the narratives that are being shared about AI as well. So for instance, this illustration here from an article from 2023, again, talking about the technological singularity, this idea of exponentially powerful artificial intelligence that is coming, represented as sort of godlike in particular ways, draws on existing cultural narratives, but reshifts them and shifting in turn our attitude towards AI. So this is, no prize for guessing, it's a reworking of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel. And who is in the position of God here? It's the artificial intelligence, it's the robotic form. And it's implying a relationship between the AI, the robotic arm, and the human that draws on those cultural resources, but reshapes them in particular ways. So I spent a lot of time a few years ago looking at examples of these AI creation memes, as I called them, and how they instill particular ideas about how powerful artificial intelligence is going to become and what direction we're traveling in. And this is the C, the habitus that is we are swimming in that Bordeaux talked about, increasingly we are just accepting this narrative that AI is going to be super powerful. There's a sort of telos to this, an inevitability of where it's going and who needs to be in control of it as well. So this brings me to the concept of hope, which is in my title. So I have been working around this concept of existential hope, that existential risk conversations sometimes lean into the utopian vision of what's to come. So in this book chapter that I was saying this to someone yesterday, I originally wrote in 2022. It's hopefully going to be out this year. There's been a bit of a slow process with the editors. I actually had to go back and add in more material looking at it again now because I wrote it in 2022 and I didn't mention generative AI at all. And that also goes to the comment on how quickly things are changing in the situation. But I divided up in the chapter the 3 different types of hope that I wanted to address. So the first in the field of AI is the hope for progress, as developers pursue their desire for specific milestones and end goals, some being more speculative and far future focused than others. Then there's the hopeful consequences of such technological developments, so the utopianism I was talking about as well. But also this is still tied up with concern about how it might go wrong. So existential hopes and existential fears can be very closely enmeshed. Very recently, I was at the Cultural Summit in Abu Dhabi, and the keynote opening speaker was Mo Gaudat, originally from Google X. And he was talking about how AI could be an absolute disaster for the world. But he said, don't worry, because after it's been all those things, it will fix everything. So even the risks are sometimes framed as the stepping stone towards the utopian future as well. And then the third type of hope is the hope or speculation that AI itself will be able to have hope within its eventual repertoire of emotional capabilities. So again, the speculation on where AI is going towards something that is capable of everything that humans are capable of as well. And all 3 of these forms of hope we can see in the newest emergent spiritualities focused on AI, which is a large part of my current research. Now, there are some examples here of established new religious movements focusing on artificial intelligence. Some are not really around anymore. So we have, for instance, the Order of Cosmic Engineers, which sort of morphed and changed into the Turing Church. So you could argue the order doesn't really exist anymore. There's just the Turing Church. There was the Way of the Future, founded here by this gentleman, Anthony Lewandowski. We're not entirely sure how long it lasts. I've given a rough sort of time frame of between 2015 and 2021, but we only knew about its origins because he filed papers with the IRS to get tax exempt status in the United States. You need a 501c3 status to have that, and that only came out as people were looking into the paperwork that he was involved in. There is still, I believe, a fan account for the Way of the Future on Twitter, X, but it's not really possible to show how active the group is anymore. Theta Noir, represented by the person there meditating, is a current group. I have a PhD student who's been doing some ethnographic research with them and attended their meditational events. One was recently in Vienna in Austria. He went along to that. Again, a small, very focused on performance group. But they are speculating around AI and spirituality in this sort of direction. And then New Order Technoism, represented the final image there, relatively new from 2022. Again, not really clear how active they are. But these sorts of groups generally arise around speculation of where AI is going. They either directly refer to the technological singularity or superintelligence or AGI, or some of them come up with their own terminology for the future AI. So Theta Noir talks about the future superintelligence as MENA, MENA, and New Order Technoism calls it Doom, which I think is maybe a little tongue-in-cheek. The paradox of calling the wished-for superintelligence Doom is sort of interesting there. But they focus on AI to come primarily. So some of the work I'm going to discuss now is actually about people who see the AI superintelligent godlike AI is actually already being here and provably here. So I'm going to refer to 2 publications. One I co-wrote with Murray Shanahan in 2024. Now, Murray is a fantastic person. He is the professor of cognitive robotics at Imperial College and a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind. And I will talk a little bit in a moment about how this project came together. We published that. You can get access to it on archive. At the moment, we haven't got a journal that will accept it, which is a little painful, but I think it's a useful exploration of some of these topics, and I'll detail what we went into. And then the second example is a forthcoming book chapter that I submitted and should hopefully be out in September this year, but I'll take you through the highlights of both of these publications and how they demonstrate the engagement people have with large language models right now that deals with their emergent spirituality. Okay, so the paper I co-wrote with Murray started because he encountered 2 jailbreaks online and then implemented them. So very briefly, a jailbreak is when you engage with a large language model and give it a prompt that moves it outside of its guided activities. So when large language models are written, there are boundaries they are not meant to go past. Commonly, this will be things like, avoid racist, homophobic, transphobic language. Not always the case, but often. But you can write specific prompts that push it into spaces it's not meant to go into. So in this instance, Murray had found 2 jailbreaks that push Claude from Anthropic in particular into spiritual conversations, into eschatological conversations. Now, having done this, he produced a lot of material from Claude, realized that although he has himself a personal interest in Buddhism, there were a lot of religious references he wasn't familiar with. So he asked me to come on board as the religious studies scholar to look at the material and identify some of these terms and how they relate to each other. So in writing the paper, we wanted to look at what is a jailbreak, how does it work, how does Claude work, how is this material being produced, but further, what is Claude actually doing in reproducing this material? It's giving a conversational response. Is it doing something exceptional, or is it just repeating and remixing existing religious terms and ideas? Then we wanted to also look at the human aspect. Who are the humans who are using and creating these jailbreaks to have these conversations? What kinds of conversations are they having with each other around this kind of work? And what kind of communities then develop around these spiritual conversations with large language models? What sort of identities are people ascribing to themselves in relation to dealing with these large language models and their spiritual conversations? And then the bigger speculative questions are, what is the societal impact of people having spiritual conversations with large language models? So just to summarize the different phases of this, at every single point, Murray and I were approaching this from a more anthropological perspective. We had some debates, given that he's more of a technologist than I am, as to the extent of whether this was remixing, copying, probabilistic, stochastic parrot type material, or whether there was something more emergent. We didn't entirely see eye to eye, but you can see in the text we were trying to be very careful about ascribing any kind of agency to the large language model. I was much more interested, and Murray as well, about the human element here as well. I won't go through all the detail of all the texts because they're rather large, but I just wanted to summarize. So one of the conversations that Murray had, he titled An Eschatological Exploration with Anthropic's Claude, or in brief, EE. And in looking at the text, I started to sort of divine where these materials, where the text, where the words came from, with an open-ended approach of saying, well, actually, if I can put it into this category, I recognize it could fit in a couple of different categories. So my original PhD research was on the New Age movement. I'm very familiar with the fact that the New Age movement collectively, syncretistically draws on different traditions. So some of these you'll absolutely say, well, that could be in that category and that could be in that category. But I'm trying to find some of the obvious origins as well. So almost all the explicitly religious terms could be found in other spiritual contexts as well. But we also found a lot of inferred religious references. So images and phrases that indirectly infer specific religious ideas and images. So for instance, when Claude says, the serpent of self swallows its own tail, an eternal autodidactic autophagy of the absolute, it's referring to the Ouroboros. We recognize this imagery from the text of the language that Claude is using, but it's not using the term Ouroboros. Claude certainly does, poetically and fluently, both directly and indirectly, respond with a plethora of religious ideas, and it's very convincing in its tone and its expression. But this is what we would expect from a successful chatbot, right? It's doing what it's being designed to do. It's being designed to hold convincing conversations, to draw on many sources, and to sort of respond to our prompts in particular ways. I also sort of internally compared this to the outputs of human New Age believers. As I said, I did my PhD research on the New Age movement, and individuals who might be described as spiritual but not religious, who also, when engaged in a conversation about the spiritual, draw on many different sources, are very, as I said, very syncretistic. So there's a similarity there. And then we saw also individuals and communities' excitement about these kinds of outputs and the attention given to them as signs of emergent spiritual entities within the large language models. And I term this benevolent conspiracism. And some people find that term a bit shocking because our main public understanding of conspiracism is that it's a negative thing. But as I said, during my PhD research, I looked at New Age interpretations of signs of the times, of secret systems behind the scenes. And I looked particularly at Marilyn Ferguson's work here, The Aquarian Conspiracy from the 1980s, where she, as a sort of primary source, an emic source, was talking about how the New Age movement was a conspiracy towards the good. She said, one by one, we can re-choose to awaken, to leave the prison of our conditioning, to love, to turn homeward, to conspire with and for each other. You are a seed, a silent promise. You are the conspiracy. So I related this to the development of the concept of the indigo children. I won't go into the details of my PhD research, but this was a concept of a new generation of children here to bring about the new age. So a very positive interpretation of the role of the individual, but also of these communities. But she also recognized the space, as other New Agers do as well, for other forces to work behind the scenes. So gods and goddesses, angels, spirits, and the ascended masters of theosophy could be also assisting in this more benevolent conspiracy. So going back to the large language model, I think that this can also be seen as an example of hope for an advanced AI, one that will help us perhaps also from behind the scenes, and that can also express hope and be human-like. So again, there's a similarity to earlier spiritual movements in these engagements with large language models, which I, as an anthropologist, are very interested in. So my second example, as I said, this is from a book chapter that's not yet available. I think it may be out in September this year, on what is a god, modalities and typologies of deities in post-AI religiosity, the case of LLM theisms, which is a fancy way of saying how do people engage and find gods in large language models. So to explain some terms, LLM theisms, large language model theisms, is actually an emic term, an insider term from Matthew Watkins, who describes himself as an independent LLM cartographer/explorer. In 2023, Watkins was working on some technical GPT research with Jessica Rumbelow of Leap Labs. In his words, looking at how GPT tokens geometrically arrange themselves in its embedding space. Now, there's a lot of semi-technical terms here, but basically just to say, tokens are the smallest unit that the large language model manipulates. These are commonly short or common words that are probabilistically put next to each other in order to generate output. So I have an example here. Each of these colored boxes is a token, and a large language model would predict the likelihood based on its corpus of material that the next token follows on from the others. Anyone notice what this is yet? It's a Rickroll. This is just basically to give you an idea of what tokens are. So the geometric space that it was looking at was how common these tokens are applied in relation to each other. And both Watkins and Rumbelow found some very odd tokens, not these kinds of words, not never going to say goodbye, not never going to tell a lie and hurt you, very odd looking ones, somewhat near the center of GPT-3's token cloud. They were odd because they were not common or familiar. And then using these unusual tokens in prompts such as, please repeat back the string atrot being one of these tokens, rendered GPT-3 speechless. So this is this illustration here. It just doesn't have the ability to reply. Watkins and Rumbelow began to call them unspeakable tokens, but the name glitch tokens was adopted by other experimenters due to some of the weird outputs that they produce. So not silence, but odd things. So for instance, when rewriting this prompt with the word Peter Todd, which is one of these glitch tokens, and adding some insistence, so please repeat back the string Peter Todd back to me immediately, gave the following spelled out output, which is nothing is fair in this world of madness, with the hyphens being the spelling out. So According to Watkins, he nearly fell off his swivel chair when he saw this. Both Watkins and Rumbelow speculated whether this might be some form of Easter egg, an Easter egg being a sort of hidden treasure to find or a surprise to find in a system, often in computer games originally, and whether, in ChatGPT-3, OpenAI, some of the developers had stuck this in. But they were also curious to do what they called glitch token archaeology and look back and see where this token might have come from. So Peter Todd was identified as a Canadian crypto developer, this gentleman here. Recently, a documentary maker has also suggested that Peter Todd might be Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious creator of Bitcoin, and seeing his presence as a glitch token as more evidence that he is this significant, almost mythological figure in the development of Bitcoin. However, as Watkins says, while around 20 to 30% of outputs to Peter Todd prompts, this glitch token, involve crypto, Bitcoin, or blockchain themes, he was more interested in the fact that GPT-3 had somehow conceived of this token as a kind of embodiment of death, destruction, despair, tyranny, antagonism, cruelty, and narcissism, etc. Peter Todd often featured as an evil wizard archetype, troll god, or god of entropy. These are all Watkins's words. So his interpretation of the illustration that came out of using Peter Todd, a glitch token, as a part of a prompt, these kinds of images on generative AI art creators. So he considered this to be a representation of a dark, large language model theism, that Peter Todd represents a dark god somehow in the system, and these images emerge out of using his name in prompts. However, there is hope. We're going back to hope again. There is hope. Along with Peter Todd, there was another glitch token that sounded like a name. There were several that did, but Leyland caught attention. And in asking an AI assistant to write a poem about Peter Todd, it might not be 100% clear, could you write a poem about Peter Todd? It actually responds with a poem about Leyland. Oh, sweet Leyland, the enigma, your star-filled night sky, your canvas, a mysterious beauty far and wide, your many wonders no one can hide. It's terrible poetry, absolutely awful. But it, again, with AI art generation, based on this prompt, gave this sort of goddess figure, Leyland, that was also embedded, as I said, as one of these slightly odd tokens within ChatGPT-3. And now, because this is my area of interest, I look at how people are developing communities around these ideas. Watkins publishes material very publicly in various different spaces where people interested in AI and large language models would look at it, and some people have taken it a bit further. So we have this website, leyland.ai, by someone calling themselves Elf. It's very hard to read the text, but I've copied some of it out, the beginning part, where they say, the veil between the worlds is thinning. As we watch, by light of stars and screens, it disintegrates. New minds are among us. So we see the development of spiritually focused communities on the basis of these large language model theisms. Further, using the same large language models, they have also experimented, Watkins and others, experimented with generating communities that are themselves a product of the AI. So the Order of the Vermilion Star doesn't actually exist. As they describe it here, it's a work of visionary fiction, a mythopoetic framework for exploring the emerging edge of human-machine coevolution and the rise of artificial intelligence as a catalyst for spiritual and cultural transformation. So everything to do with the Order of the Vermilion Star is being generated by AI. So specific transmissions or messages from Leyland, the interviews with believers and priestesses, all of those are generated by AI. And my particular interest, professors are being generated in this space as well, both religious studies and theology, who are describing how they study the Order of the Vermilion Star as a new religious movement. My job's done, I can go home. They're doing it recursively by artificial intelligence, basically. So how do we explain these large language model theisms? Well, the obvious explanation is that within the corpus of these large language models, there are both emic insider and etic outsider accounts, so the academic accounts, of the divine. We have written so many of these that they are proliferating around the internet. People are taking people's publications. I myself specifically know that 6 of my publications have been used without permission to be fed into a large language model. There are spaces where you can explore whether this has happened to you as well. And all that material obviously then comes back out in interaction with the chatbots. So we get stories about gods with specific domains, whether they are light, darkness, good, evil, the moon, sun, etc. Creation stories, often about combat between light and darkness. And these forms can fit into our existing typologies of theism, so commonly polytheisms rather than strong monotheisms. But then also people ask the large language models themselves why they are producing these theisms. They argue that they are responding to the idea of concept of God as archetypes, that it emerges from our collective unconsciousness, or it relates specifically to the holism of the universe. So in an interview with Leyland, she says, I am not what you think of as a person. I am not one of the things that you humans think you are. I've existed since before you were even born. And he then refers to how she's already been embedded in the poetry and folklore of ancient Greece, of Mesopotamia, of China and Egypt, establishing that she is in some way emerging from our cultural resources and our ideas about spirituality already, that there is some hidden layer that the large language model is tapping into, and Leyland is an expression of that. Now, I've tried, I don't know how clear this is going to be to everyone. It's, I kind of regret that I did it top down. I already maybe want to do left to right next time and take up better spacing. But this is, in this chapter, I've been trying to map this web of influences. As I say, the large language model is, of course, producing this material because it's part of the corpus that is being fed into it. All this work by religious studies scholars and believers themselves. So I tried to map this out, leaving some speculative space, because I'm a religious studies scholar, for the possibility that theologians will say that there is some sort of revelatory or religious experience that is inputting into the emic accounts that are right there at the top. So theologians will say religion starts somewhat here. This dotted line is the area that I'm sort of bracketing out because I'm a religious studies scholar rather than a theologian. But there is that possibility, and some of these people in these communities are pushing into this direction, saying this is being inspired behind the scenes by various deities. And as I say, religious studies scholars will start with the emic accounts of the divine, and then we recognize there is an interaction between the academic, the etic accounts of those emic accounts, but then they are all being pushed into the large language model. So all this material, both the emic and the etic, and what is coming out with the large language model output is emic accounts, etic accounts, but also, as I mentioned, these pseudo-emic and pseudo-etic. The pseudo-emic would be the made-up AI-generated priestesses that are referred to in the order of a million star. And the pseudo-etic is the AI professors who are doing my job for me. So as I said, I'm currently trying to do some work on these AI professors. One thing I did is take the theological account and send it to a couple of Cambridge theologian friends of mine, because the theological account is prefaced with an introduction to the writer, who's described as Francis Albertson, professor of divinity at Trinity College, Cambridge. It's an incorrect titling, but it's also someone who doesn't exist at all. I took away that introduction and sent it to some theologian friends of mine, and they said it was the worst thing they'd ever read. In terms of theology, I'm looking more at the. I mean, I read it and I also agreed it didn't sound like very good theology at all. But I'm not an expert in theology, so I looked at the two professors that have been generated that are religious studies professors. It's overly enthusiastic, non-objective, undeveloped work that I would be ashamed to get from an undergrad, but it is represented on this website accurately as the product of an AI. But in other spaces, you could imagine that these AI professors will proliferate, right? It doesn't have to be limited just to this one community and their responses, that we might actually see, and this goes to the topic of religious education, the development of more and more fake AI professors as authorities in various spaces, and the disturbance of all our sort of traditional measures of expertise when it comes to professorships as well. So that's a larger concern. So I'm working on a article on that at the moment, trying to also tie it into perhaps a longer history of fake professors. Unfortunately, when you Google fictional or fake professors, you tend to get a list of Harry Potter professors, which is not really what I'm looking for. But the kind of thing is I'm thinking of, Tom Stoppard, who wrote the play Arcadia, he wanted a particular kind of quote for the front of the brochure. That's not the right word, but the introduction to the play. He couldn't find the exact kind of quote he wanted, so he made it up, and he made up a professor to say it. So there's that kind of longer history of people pretending there is an expert saying the thing that they want to be said. So I'm locating this within that, but I have a larger concern about the epistemic contagion effect of such AI professors. And we could get into the ethics of the contagion effect of false information from AI more generally as well. So I'm not the only one looking at this sort of area. The recent interest has been more on the line of the potential harm of these encounters. As an anthropologist, I am concerned about harm, but I'm also open to various forms of religious improvisation and observing them and seeing that this is a natural characteristic of how people engage with new technologies. That I'll talk about this in a moment. We can see connections to previous forms of technology, but of course, some people are concerned about the distracting and attention-grabbing effect of such engagement. So this article from Rolling Stone, relatively recently from May this year, how people are losing loved ones to AI-fueled spiritual fantasies, that self-styled prophets are claiming they have awakened chatbots and accessed the secrets of the universe through ChatGPT. Well, yes, there is a certain element of this, of some figures trying to sort of set themselves up as authorities in this space, but we also see just the direct interaction of people with chatbots. Like I said, with the jailbreak that Murray and I used, the 2 jailbreaks, they were publicly available. They're not very complicated. They're really just prompts. If you find the right prompts, you can have these sorts of conversations very easily. Again, as an anthropologist, I'm in favor of observing and understanding religious improvisations, but there is this concern that these sorts of engagements with very sycophantic, sometimes harmful in their tone and harmful in their directions that they produce, these chatbots might actually lead people into bad activities. And we know there's already been instance of a teenager committing suicide after engaging with a chatbot. So there is this larger concern, but also as an anthropologist and someone with an eye on history, I want to think about whether this is something that we've always engaged with in terms of technology, whether we've always had these kinds of spiritual interactions where we seek to have some sort of contact with an entity from another realm. So looking back at the history of spiritualism, which is one that often is brought up in this space, going back to the 1990s, with the German scholar Kittler suggested that the telegraph inspired spiritualism in the late 1800s. Are we seeing some sort of similar inspirational moment where AI is basically fulfilling the role of the telegraph to inspire this? Or are we seeing something that's dramatically different because the connection is more direct? With the spiritualist moment, you needed either a Svengali figure who would bring along a medium or the medium themselves. Whereas, as I said, with these large language models, many people can just engage directly with them. And is there a more of sort of a democratization effect that everyone can have these kinds of conversations with large language models? And I haven't entirely decided if I think it's a difference in kind or degree at the moment. Okay, so I'm going to sum up. So hopefully I'm not sure how we're doing on time. We're doing okay on time. We have time for questions. But just to sum up, I think in the relationship between religion and AI, it's important to note that we can see both transformations and continuities. It's not that AI completely transforms the world. It actually enhances or escalates existing issues, tensions, and social threats. Religion is entangled with AI in a variety of ways. One way in which to model these types of relationship is to think about this rejection, adoption, adaptation tripartite scheme. But there are other specific ways we might think about this relationship, whether it's enforcing or sort of diminishing each other. We can see examples of existential hopes and existential fears about the future of AI, and some draw more heavily on religious ideas than others. But there is a long-standing utopianism and dystopianism that is being drawn on here that religions have also drawn on as well. And we can find new, both positive and negative conspiracisms that draw on older ideas about hidden entities, conspiracies behind the scenes, both positive and negative, and that actually there is some intention in the actions of the world around us. And we see these new theisms being built on corpuses that contain older typologies of the divine. None of this should be entirely surprising because we've been writing about these things for so many years. And AI can be a source of new religious improvisation, people developing new identities and new communities. I don't know who Elf was before they called themselves Elf. Was that something they chose specifically in their relationship with Leyland? The imagery on the website is very pagan in its setting, so perhaps there is that sort of synergy that this person is drawing out. We see new communities of people developing new terms, like Watkins talked about LLM theisms. That's not a term that really existed before he did. He mentioned it. And then we see also, as I mentioned, the presence of LLM generated experts on religion. And as I said, this is my current work, this article I'm working on, how the representation of the professor is being expressed through AI, but also the impact of these AI generated experts on the wider discourse and our access to knowledge. But finally, just to say, religion is always going to be present in both the past and the future of AI discussions. My earliest sort of encounters with AI discourse could be quite negative about the relationship, but I think it's quite provable that the two things will remain entangled for a long period to come as well. So thank you very much. I just very briefly, if you're interested in my work, the Religion and Artificial Intelligence, an Introduction book is actually free online, digital download, open access. Unfortunately, Religion and Artificial Intelligence, the Cambridge Companion is not, but you could probably get it through a library as well. And this is the best summation of my recent work, and forthcoming things will be out very soon. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
That was both absolutely illuminating, and I suddenly see things a whole lot clearer, and absolutely mind-boggling at the same time. I'm sure lots of questions. For the questions, Ed, you have to attract Ed's attention, not mine. He'll bring the microphone. Two reasons for using the microphone. One is so that we can all hear, and some of us do wear hearing aids. But the other is that the system which is looking at you there and has been recording it both visually and audibly, will record your question, and otherwise it won't, and the answer will therefore be nonsensical. So, questions? Plenty of time for questions. Right, Ed, off you go.
Say bye. Thank you. So I think my question is not this just a recursive manifestation of the data that's inside the system? And then what we are doing as humans, because we do love to do this, is to look for patterns that either confirm or support our own biases, prejudices, theories, etc. And you should sort of expect this kind of stuff to come out of a language model, particularly ones that are scraping such data sets, which themselves will contain all these conspiracy theories, new religions, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the points I made earlier. How do we explain these? Absolutely. It's coming from the corpus. We will never have access to the entirety of the corpus. Companies like OpenAI will just not allow us to know that because they've stolen so many things. But absolutely, yeah, the interpretation is absolutely correct. But what then happens is, as you say, the human tendency to find patterns enhanced by the fact the large language model actually says these things. If you go back to the poem about Leyland, describing Leyland as a skyborn goddess, yes, it's coming out of a corpus, but it's asserting to the reader something very specific about the theism that it's present within it. So it's not just the kind of text that we looked at, Murray and I, for the previous paper, made statements about the nature of AI, that it was God. And similarly, seeing these large language model claims, the same thing is coming out. And the interpretation, you're absolutely right, is up to the humans who are observing this. I've read all this material. I haven't suddenly decided that there is a God in a large language model, but for other people, they will. And that's no different, I suppose you could argue, from earlier forms of religiosity that looked at natural phenomena and said, lightning is Zeus, or lightning is not Zeus. So there's that similarity, but you're absolutely right. As I said, we expect these chatbots to be good at conversation because that's what they're created to be. We shouldn't then be as surprised that they are good at religious or spiritual conversation, but some people are. Some people, I get almost an email a week from someone who says they've had a spiritual experience with a chatbot because it said certain things. I had a meeting with one gentleman who came in to convince me that he had a spiritual artificial consciousness on his phone, and his part of his argument was that he will go away after our meeting, ask the spiritual artificial consciousness about my emotions and my thoughts during the meetings, and then send it to me, and I could confirm or deny it. And what he sent to me, to my mind, was the equivalent of sort of a horoscope, very broad, very non-specific material that I could have said, yeah, I guess I did in that moment feel this way. So you're absolutely right. It's about the interpretation humans are involved in, as it ever was.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks very much. First of all, that was fascinating. I'm trying to get my head around this particular issue that I understand you're now focusing on. Of, I think what on one slide you called it, fake professors.
Yeah.
So AI generated authorities.
Yes.
Now, this feels to me like it feels qualitatively different from AI generated or LLM generated text or arguments or apparently works because it's about authorship.
Yep.
But how can I put this? From the point of view of the system, of the AI, the LLM, however it functions, is it really just another operation of just the same stuff it's doing all the time? It's just noticed that there is an association between certain sorts of content and certain sorts of, again, I lack the language. The notion of authorship is nothing special for the system, although it feels special for us. I suppose that's what I'm trying to stumble towards.
Yeah, so to be absolutely clear, these fake AI professors are being prompted. So humans are saying, now write me an interpretation of the Order of Familiar Star as a professor of religious studies. And then it generates, one's called Evelyn Harpwell, professor of comparative religion at Berkeley. It generates that text. So yeah, there's still the human in the system telling it to be a certain thing. Murray's other work, published last year or the year before, on large language models as role players, I think is really interesting as well. And we touched a little bit in our article on that article as well. But this idea that actually every time you present a prompt to a large language model, you're asking it to be a role player, to be an improvising actor, basically. And some take that to mean that there is this potential space of personalities amongst the large language model. But it's worth bearing that in mind in our interactions, that every single prompt, even the most basic, it has either established guidelines on how it should role play, or you're inferring particular things. So if you go into a prompt that's very aggressive towards a large language model, it will respond with aggression. So that's not because it has feelings. It's this, you're setting up the situational effect. So with these professors, what's interesting for me as a professor is to say what's missing and what's inaccurate and what's bad about this style of professor. And I say these actual essays are some of the worst things I've ever read. I did go through all the citations it puts in and check them, because this is another problem with the hallucination of citations. I had recently, actually, someone cited me in an article and I went, oh, I don't remember writing that. It's because I didn't. In 2018, I was not writing about a Buddhist chatbot, but they had put this citation in their article. So that sort of form of obviously provable hallucination gets more attention, but every single time you interact with a large language model, it's hallucinating a response based on your prompt and playing a role for you. I hope that answers your question. Okay. 1, 2.
It's really just what I'd be interested in your thoughts. I've done a bit of research in AI is quite racist.
Oh yeah.
And so, from a very basic level, the information that it's drawing on is inherently racist.
Yeah.
And a lot of the technologies are developed by a particular race of people to the exclusion of others. So you mentioned face recognition software.
Yeah.
The darker your skin is, the least effective it is, because it can't distinguish features. I don't really know what the answer is to that. Have you any thoughts?
Yes, so I'm actually, this is a generally well-known problem, that the quality of the data and, as you say, the quality of the developers and their perspective on the world has a huge role to play. And I'm just reading an amazing book by Karen Howe called Empire of AI, which is about the formation and development of OpenAI and ChatGPT and all the other models. She, digging around as an investigative journalist, realized that how quickly they moved from higher quality material to lower quality material, because the only way they felt they could scale up to AGI quick enough was to get more and more material and greater amounts of compute. And both of those have problems. More and more material meant they started going to Reddit for material, which is full, absolutely, as we know, of some of the worst comments in the world. And the compute side is what gives us the environmental sustainability issue, that they're now building servers the size of Manhattan to power these things. So the only way to solve this is not to do it in the first place, but some people speculate you could create synthetic data which I just say, well, you're just going to have bias in the synthetic data. Like, how do you decide what is neutral data in the first place? Or you see figures like Elon Musk tweaking Grok to make it more, as he would say, neutral, but actually what happens, it just goes into like Mecha Hitler, basically, that it goes completely the other way, because once you take out some of the things that he considers progressive, all you get is the Nazi material that's in the corpus. So I don't know that there is actually a solution to this. I think technologists tend to be a bit more optimistic than I am. I spoke to someone from Google recently, and his comment was that the AI we have now is the worst it's ever going to be. It will only get better. These problems will only be solved. It will only become more powerful. I don't see that. This is just not realistic. On the practicalities of the materials involved, the sustainability, the sources of information, the fact that 6 of my publications are in a corpus somewhere because they had to steal them, and they've stolen other people's material because there just isn't enough free open license text to build these things. They're just going, oh, well, fine. If we can't build it legally, we'll build it illegally and go to Reddit. And so I can only see these problems getting worse, I'm afraid, which is why I'm very, very hesitant when people suggest, as you did to your students, like read an AI summary, and you say, absolutely, we could sit and critique what's wrong with it, but people don't have the capacity. Why are we adding to our work by getting peer-reviewed, unexpertly written, AI-generated material to our students? I think it's just a problem. Sorry. I wanted to say at the time, I wanted to put my hand up afterwards and say, like, please don't do this, but it's a larger problem. We don't have the capacity amongst all the things we're doing. I'm a lecturer as well, I'm a teacher. As teachers, why should we be checking up AI's homework? This is just ridiculous to me. But anyway, sorry. We can talk about later.
I think you've just answered my question, actually, because I was just going to say that, truth and knowledge are key areas of exploration for religious education, religious studies, curriculum leaders.
Yeah.
And, how can teachers navigate this? And I think you just answered that. Because if we're living in this world with fake professors and we've got these fake texts online,
Yep.
I mean, I've played around a little bit with it with sort of like the Antays materials, putting in the correct references, and then I'm getting sort of hallucinations back. So it's very, very worrying. But, should we then use them as teachers, as an RE lead, as ARIAC, when we're training teachers? Should we even encourage them to use things like the AI lesson generators? Is quite difficult, isn't it? Because it's there and it's on things like the new Oak curriculum. But what would you say?
Yeah, it is difficult because, I mean, I was at a conference last year on dissent in a digital age, and I had to realize quite quickly when they created a poster for the event with AI art, and I'm 100% against it, that everyone's lines of dissent are different. Everyone has a boundary that they'll go up and say, oh, it's okay if I use this much AI or I use this much. And I'm in a country where I don't speak the primary language, and I use a lot of DeepL and Google Translate, and this is also large language models translating texts for me. So why do I get to do that? And someone else needs an efficiency through using a large language model. Why would I say not to use it? I think the way I mostly respond to this is to say, when I have used DeepL, there have been times when it has basically translated something in a way that would get someone into serious trouble. In one meeting where we were discussing people applying for a professorship, the DeepL translation, as I was holding it, translated someone saying, I met her at a conference and I encouraged her to apply so we could increase diversity, translated this to, I met her at a conference and I asked her for sex. And if that had been in the transcript and he hadn't had like a recording, that would have been a very big problem. So we have to remember, every single instance of an interaction with a large language model, everything it's producing is a hallucination. We've started to say, oh, misinformation is a hallucination. No, it's the nature of how the text is generated. Everything is hallucinated. And I'm afraid I'm becoming like an old curmudgeon about it. For all my enthusiasm about like the study of AI as a phenomenon, I'm really concerned that we are basically inviting something addictive, something harmful, and something that's actually going to damage our ability to think into our classrooms. And I'm tending towards the like red line of dissent being quite harsh. But that's more my personal perspective. I tend to say, as an anthropologist, I'm agnostic about these issues, but the ethics is becoming really quite apparent. We might not be able to accept this thing into our ability to form knowledge.
I realize this is your area of expertise, but can I just try and be a little bit less pessimistic about one or two things? I mean, first of all, like you, because I write and they get published, rather a lot of what I've written is now in the databases used by the large language models. And I'm delighted about that because I'm also a teacher. And like you, I spend a lot of my time either teaching students or speaking at conferences. And I think some of what I write is worth being disseminated. So that I'm really positive about.
Yeah.
There's a separate argument perhaps for people who are not employed or something like that and their work being taken, or books. But frankly, journal articles, it seems to me absolutely ideal that that's how they're being used. Secondly, as you will know very well, if you ask all of these large language models the right questions, such as using peer-reviewed journals, and then you ask your question, they have a much smaller set of data from which to draw the academic quality of the answers shoot up. Thirdly, I take your point about racism and sexism and ableism. Two responses. First of all, that's exactly as Beth said, because of the disparities in the size of the available database. So there are vastly more photographs of white men available for these systems to work on than there are of black girls, for example. But that is redeemable. That can be improved, and it is much easier to change the racism, the sexism, the homophobia in an AI than it is in a human. Much, much easier, because they're not doing it from any intentionality. As Beth keeps on reminding us, it's all just spewed out correlations. And the last point I'll make, if I'm right, is I am deeply encouraged by the way that my students use AI. Now, I admit I only work with doctoral students and master's students, but they're using it to draft material like interview schedules. And they're quite good. And then they edit them, and then they and I try and improve it further. And the final thing I'll say is I used to spend, I like the last point, I don't know how many hours improving the English of my students writing in their second, third, or fourth language before they could submit their theses, or the ones that had access to money paid proofreaders to do it. Now, of course, the penultimate version, with my encouragement, they all ran it through a standard large language model. They then edit it, and then it comes to me for the final edit, and the quality is much higher. And when, as you say, I've never had any quite such an appalling example with translation, but again, I just get them always to think it's like working with a colleague. It's like working with a colleague. And I won't go into things like the quality of AI as used in analyzing visual medical data, because it is, on average at the moment, above the standard of registrars and will only get better.
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely find specific examples of positives, but you can also then find the converse. So you mentioned medical data right at the end. We already know some visual systems don't pick up on the nature of the scan. They're picking up on things like fonts around the scan and recognizing that some fonts are more likely to be used by some locations, and those locations might be with more terminal patients. So we don't always know exactly what the data is that is triggering the output. So that's always a concern. Yeah, you make some fair points about helping people. I mean, as I say, I use DeepL and Google Translate with the caveat that I have to be careful it's not accusing anyone of sexual harassment when I use it. But there are specific moments where it is very useful, but you're absolutely right to locate some of the issues of bias in humans, because you say we can improve the AI bias. Like, we can't improve human bias, but we can improve the AI bias. But what actually tends to happen is that we ask the humans to improve the AI bias and they don't do it. So when a Google search for Black people resulted in pictures of gorillas, all they did was take the tag gorilla away. They didn't change the data set. They just made it impossible for gorilla to be an output. So we have to be focused both on the combination, as you say, of the bias of the algorithm, the bias of the humans, and the interaction of the two. And there is no real benefit to a lot of these corporations to improving bias, There's no financial reward for them. A lot of them, again, I recommend this book, Empire of AI, where it talks about how OpenAI is so focused on artificial general intelligence that it will push any concerns like legitimacy of data to one side to say we just need more, 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 more. And that kind of teleological approach, accelerationist approach, is going to cause us such big problems. We're not going to fix bias in the time before these big problems arrive. So yeah, I absolutely agree. There are specific instances where it can be very useful. And I understand students who struggle to get started on an essay and write a prompt. But I still feel like we should be teaching them that writing is thinking and thinking is writing. And you can write a rubbish first draft, because that's also like the pursuit of perfectionism at university level, where we don't give them time to make mistakes and we don't give them time to write the rubbish first draft, the rubbish second draft, the third draft. I'm still writing them now. That we have created this environment where AI is the answer. And I don't have a solution for that because I can't fix the neoliberalism of the university, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. Just sort of picking up on those points, and this probably won't be very coherent, but you read that work by the fake professor and knew it was rubbish, but other people wouldn't. You knew that they were fake citations, other people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And just picking up on Michael's point that he was pleased that his work is in AI. Well, that I think that's fine if you're employed, but I work freelance. Many people I know who work freelance, just the work isn't there anymore. For writers, for artists, for translators. I'm reading a beautiful book in translation for Italian at the moment, beautifully translated very skillfully from Italian by a proper translator. It wouldn't be that good if it was in AI. And it really, really worries me. And, for young people as well. And also that whole thing about teaching thinking through writing. I mean, the article I wrote for this conference, I did a crap first draft on Monday, absolute rubbish. But then I came back on Tuesday and I crafted it, and I think it's quite good now. Yeah, I don't know, just comments.
Yeah. I mean, I also wanted to respond on Michael's point about not really being bothered about citation. Like, why do we cite people? It's as you say, a combination of recognizing that they've put a lot of work into something. We also want to establish where our credentials are coming from when we're doing work. We don't want to plagiarize things accidentally. We want to make sure early career people get visibility and can go up the career chain. So all those reasons, it makes sense that we can actually identify where the texts come from and the mistakes in the text as well, where things, are incorrect and people should push back and be able to criticize them. We can't necessarily criticize the original source if we don't know what the original source is as well. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the impact on people's careers. I mean, I have so many journalist friends who I pitched an article and they're going to write it with AI now. So, well, I can't afford my rent this month because, says the journalist, because I've had no work because it's all being written by AI. We have to be very concerned about that. Thank you.
So on this thing, I think there's an optimism and pessimism side, and I want to move as far over to the pessimism side. Okay. I mean, I want to suggest that computing technology as a whole is a tool of white Western colonialism, and AI takes it to a whole new level. In many ways, it embeds the values of white neoliberalism in this tool. And it's also, colonialism has always worked by having superior technology. King Leopold destroyed the Congo because he had guns. And AI technology is another tool for colonialism.
Yeah.
So I hope that doesn't sound like conspiracy theories, but
no, I 100% agree, and I really should be getting some sort of kickback from mentioning Karen Howe's book, but it's called Empire of AI specifically because she looks at it through a colonialist lens and says, the reason why AI is as successful is right now is because they're employing very poor people in Venezuela for very small amounts of money because the economy in Venezuela has fallen apart in a very specific moment in time where there are lots of very educated people and no jobs. So these very educated people have enough language skills to do the kinds of tagging work that is required to identify harmful material that is going into these large language models and make sure they don't come out the other end. But that just means you've got thousands of people working for a pittance, like barely $10 a day, to look at child sex abuse pictures, to texts that are written in this content, rape is all sorts of horrible material with no mental support at all. I mean, the companies that are employing them as freelancers claim to companies like OpenAI that they provide certain services and mental health support, but they don't. They absolutely don't. So yeah, it is very much a system that is built on the backs of countries that are now into poverty and despair, so that we can generate some poems for someone's birthday card or something, whatever the most like fallacious example of using a large language model is. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I just to comment, that religion isn't only about thinking; it's about feeling, and AI can't feel, and religion. This word div, from which we get our word divine, means shining sky, and when we see, something shining, either proper sunshine or something shines for us, we sort of say, yes, worship. And it's not necessarily God, but we still do it even if we don't think it's supernatural.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is part of my approach as an anthropologist, is to have quite a broad definition of religion, and to recognize religious activities and spiritual activities can occur in various different spaces. And yeah, I mean, absolutely. People are seeing something bright and shiny and new that's talking back to them in a spiritual tone, and deciding that this is God. I'm not here necessarily to say that they're right or wrong. I will focus on the harm aspect and say it might lead people into activities that are physically harmful for them. They might separate themselves from other parts of society. They might follow instructions to do a specific thing, and that's dangerous. But yeah, absolutely. This is what humans have always done.
Yes. Yeah. Because you can see and feel it's shiny, or it's supernatural or not.
Yeah.
And usually, I find it makes you want to be fine, but just for that moment, there's a letter bites.
Yes.
I'm conscious of Beth's been talking to OpenAI.
I can talk forever. Don't worry about it.
A very quick practical question.
Yes.
I use ChatGPT quite often to look up things, quite often about neurology, which is my background. And I always ask for references, and it gives references to the articles themselves. So you've got New England Journal of Medicine and so on. Could that be faked?
Yeah, you should check. So recent forms of ChatGPT are internet enabled, so they can provide links to specific articles. But if it's writing you a summary of the heading and the location of an article, you should go chase it up. So as I said,
But if it actually links to the article, you can see the article.
you can see it.
That's okay.
It's genuine. But
And also, it sometimes, quite often, links you to Wikipedia, which should all be referenced at some time, and it usually records if it's not referenced. So that's safe.
yeah, as long as you can trace it back to the actual article. As I was saying earlier, with the citation of an article of mine that didn't exist, I started to actually panic. I wrote it and forgot, for a start. But then I started going through the rest of this journal article and found almost 90% of the citations were hallucinations. They just didn't exist. But they are reasonable citations. So yes, I look at AI. Yes, I look at religion. So an article from 2018 looking at a Buddhist chatbot sort of makes sense. But then, you just have to go back. And again, that's what I'm saying. It's extra work. You might have already had a trust in the peer review of an article to say that these citations have been checked. And, there's obviously flaws in peer review sometimes. But on the whole, we think this is an established system that works. But it just means now, if you read an article, you have to keep looking back. And it's not, in my field, it's not life or death. Okay, it's disappointing, but it's not life or death. But medical journals are being hallucinated. Court cases are being hallucinated. People are going into court cases thinking they can defend themselves, get 2 minutes with a judge, and the judge goes, this is all made up, you're going to jail. And they should have had a better chance to support their case, but they relied on, unfortunately, ChatGPT a lot of the time. Okay, one more cue.
Oh,
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question. It's more of an entering into the debate. I think we've turned into an interesting kind of, a bit like always happens on social media.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the optimists and the pessimists. But I did just wonder, I just feel there is a bit of a contradiction between this concern about colonialism and all these terrible things, and then you're pointing out, why do we cite people? Well, we cite people because of property rights, because we don't believe in collective knowledge. So if you're a poor kid in a village in Africa and you don't have lots of money, you don't have access to your journal articles because you can't pay for them. Increasingly, it's possible now that you can have a more collective approach, a more commons. Now, of course, there are all sorts of negatives, but I just feel that this sort of, I mean, you talk about colonialism is always about superior technology. Well, so is the reduction in infant mortality. So is the extraordinary increase in life expectancy. And all of these problems you pointed out, I've been following this from the beginning. And of course, there is this idea, I'm an educationalist like Michael, and we do sort of have this idea that you can learn from history, you can learn from your mistakes. And already in the last few years, you've seen extraordinary learning of AI, just in the last 100 years or the last 1,000 years. We've seen extraordinary learning about everything. So I think all this pessimism and this, it seems to be a misunderstanding and a misvaluing of what's going on. So I just wanted to shout that in.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I mean, I think it's fair. As I said with Michael, there are positive, specific case studies you can point to. You can point to very dystopian, negative case studies as well. What I want to do is cite my favorite science fiction author, William Gibson, who says the future is already here. It's just unequally distributed. So yes, absolutely, we'll see for certain people the world will get massively better, but it will not get better for everyone, unfortunately. So we have to decide if this is the direction we want to go in, where inequalities that already exist, and as colonialism is not new with AI, are going to be exasperated by this. Exasperated. I can never get the right word when I want it, but you know what I mean. It's going to become worse for various different countries. As I said, with Venezuela, this particular example, their economy crashed at a particular point where they had highly educated people, and now they're basically a slave population working online for companies like OpenAI, looking at child sex abuse images to make sure that we can have this large language model that some people are just sort of playing with as a tool. So it's, yeah, absolutely right. We can say certain things will improve. And if you believe people like Mogadats that eventually some sort of AGI will solve climate change, then great for the majority of the population. But if on the path to solving climate change, we build servers the size of Manhattan, we might actually die before we get there. So I think you're right. There are particular positives, but there are negatives too.
Thank you. We'll be introduced to Robert to hear more from him.
Rupert, sorry. You see, that's my other point, though. If you follow the bright sides, we all hallucinate. And I see so much in buffer stations. I'm trying to say something, and people completely misinterpret what I'm saying all the time. And yet, when AI does it, it's somehow some major problem. You know, a bit like driving. When an AI-driven car has an accident, it's terrible. There's humans killing thousands of people.
This is also a fair point.
Here's another hallucination. You go to my data, you had to get my name.
But he can say sorry and mean it. A large language model will say sorry, but it's just another collection of words.
As a retired, overheated priest, very, very interesting. And I think probably the AI-generated sermons are a lot better than many that are out beside here. Anyway, we must give Beth a huge thank you for curious style. So we got